Welcome to Presidency in the Press at the Fitzwater Center at Franklin Pierce University. It's our keynote talk tonight on political polling. And I'm Christina. I'm an assistant professor of political science here at Franklin Pierce University. And with us tonight we have Peter Maer, retired CBS News White House correspondent, and Bruce Zanca, presidential aide and communications advisor to 3 presidential administrations, and a successful businessman, here to talk about who uses polling, how they use polling, why we use polling, and maybe what happens when polls go bad. So thank you guys for coming.
Great to be here.
Great to be here.
So Peter, you spent a lot of time with CBS News. The news agencies are some of the sort of premier polling agencies, I think, and that's where a lot of people get their polling information from. What stands out to you about news polling, political polling in general?
Well, CBS News, and sometimes in cooperation with the New York Times, the CBS News New York Times poll, and the CBS News polls, very scientific polls, and I will allow you, Professor, to describe and define what makes a scientific poll. But they do polls on all kinds of things, and especially they become heavy items of interest every 2 years. This audience knows, after hearing me yak at a couple of other sessions, that I like to collect quotes. And if I could kick us off with a couple of quotes about polls.
Absolutely.
The first one is from, you'll never guess, Marlin Fitzwater. Mr. Fitzwater, at White House briefings, whenever asked about a poll about his boss, President Reagan, or his boss, President George H.W. Bush, invariably responded, polls go up and polls go down. That was his standard answer, and you just couldn't get him to budge past that. I reminded him of that recently, and he remembered a time when one of the president's poll numbers were in the dumpster, and he said, I guess I should have just said that day, polls go down. But he did say polls go up and polls go down. Now, here's one of my favorites, and you can use this one, Professor. Polls are like perfume. Nice to smell, but dangerous to swallow. That from the late Israeli leader Shimon Peres in a 2013 BBC interview. If only we had kept that second one especially in mind during the 2016 campaign, and even leading up to the early and mid hours of election night, when everybody and his brother and sister thought that Hillary Clinton was going to win based on the polls. That night, even though I had retired, CBS News was kind enough to bring me back as what they called a CBS News contributor, and I was sitting in CBS News headquarters in New York in the radio newsroom and watching my computer as the New York Times had sort of looked like a speedometer, and when the night started, it said 85, between 85 and 90, that Hillary Clinton was going to win. And all evening long, it started to shake a little bit, and then down it went. And I was sitting with one of the CBS News analysts, one of your colleagues from academia, Professor Leonard Steinhorn, and he said that relatively early on in the evening, as he looked at the precincts, Donald Trump's going to win this thing. And I was stunned. And as the evening as our talk goes on, we can talk about why, in retrospect, this happened with the polls.
Sure. First, you get the White House experience as well. What stands out to you about the use of political polling?
Well, I have to tell you, I think the big thing about polling is it's gotten a lot harder to do an accurate poll, you know, particularly in this century. I guess I'd ask the students here in the audience, how many of you at home don't have a landline? You just use a cell phone.
Your family.
Your family just doesn't do it. You see, that's one of the things that's made it very, very difficult about that. You know, I got a cell phone 15 years ago in Connecticut. I have a Connecticut number on my cell phone, and I haven't lived in Connecticut with that, you know, area code identifier on it in over 10 years. And so it makes it really difficult. You know, back in the 60s and the 70s and even the early 80s, you would have a home telephone number, and that would allow the polling companies to be able to get an accurate sample where they would call out to some home. They would ask some identifying questions to kind of qualify the sample, you know, if they were qualified to answer the questions, and then they would go on and do that. So today, to get an accurate sampling is in the day of you know, cell phones or smartphones, it's a much more difficult process for doing that. I also think one of the things that's happened over time is that I'm not sure the general public is forthright or even honest in their answers about what happens in all of that. They don't necessarily want to share with a stranger on the telephone how they feel about something or what's happening. And so, you know, consequently, I think there can be some false answers when it goes to take a look at it. I do think the polls can be very useful if they're used correctly over time, particularly if you're asking the same questions over an extended period of time, from year in and year out. You know, in business, I worked for a publishing company called Bankrate, and we used polling as part of our editorial process and what we would write pretty regularly. And what we would do is we would add some questions, 5 questions, onto an omnibus poll. That was a poll that was done by a polling organization to ask specific questions. And 4 of those questions were always the same question about the economy. How much you were planning on spending, how much you were planning on saving, if you thought you were doing better than this year or worse than better this year than last year. I forget what the other one was, so what happened is we were able to take the data that was presented in that poll and to do a trend story over time. So it showed that you know, every year at Christmas we did a story about what people were planning on spending on holiday gifts or not spending on holiday gifts based on that polling that would do that. So that was a useful exercise over time to track it, and since we had been doing it for several years, we were able to draw a trend line in the story and take a look at that. It's a useful process. I think in political polling, I'm not certain right now how accurate they are or what happens. Certainly if you look at this last presidential election, all of the indicators, as Peter indicated when he talked about it, was that there was going to be a different result in the election, and it surprised a lot of people. I'm not quite sure how to fix it.
The fact of the matter is, you know, no major survey, no major poll showed Donald Trump leading in the key states that led to his electoral college win. You know, we're talking Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania. You know, I have to say I'm not an expert on polls. You are, but I respect the people who run the top polls, including the CBS News poll, and they got the popular vote nearly right, but they blew it on the electoral vote outcome. And a few days after the election, the guy in charge of the CBS polls gave a very honest appraisal of it. Anthony Salvanto answered the blunt question posed to him by the then anchor of the CBS Evening News, Scott Pelley. How did the polls lead us astray? And Anthony said that the states that were polled right up until the election showed a tightening moving toward Donald Trump. Places like Ohio and Florida. But the states that Trump really flipped, reliably Democratic states, the ones I mentioned, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, they didn't see as much late polling towards the end. And that's why he thinks this happened. And he said the pollsters may have written those states off because they'd gone Democratic in recent elections and in the polls. And as I said earlier to all of you, you get in trouble when you make assumptions. And it seems to me that they assumed that those states were going that way.
I think one of the things that will happen in the future is you'll see technology evolution make a difference in this. So I don't know if you've ever heard about what's called dial testing. But, you know, you'd see some of the news organization, I think CBS is one of the ones that did this, that during a presidential debate, they would have a sample group of people you know, a small group, maybe 25 people that would watch this, and they would give them a little controller. And as they were watching the debate, they would, if they liked something, would turn it up, and if they didn't like something, they would turn it down. And what it did was allowed for an analysis of the debate participants' words to be kind of graphed, and what was resonating and what wasn't resonating with the target audience in terms of that. I think that those are you know, useful exercises to go on to see the public's perceptions about what's happening in a live event. That's a different variation on polling that I think could work. That's something that in business, you know, focus groups and polling are something that businesses use all the time to make decisions about their products and services and what takes place in that.
So how do you think the pollsters, the scientific pollsters, are going to be able to get past this telephone dilemma with so many cell phones out there when they used to call landlines, and that just is not practical anymore?
It's a great question. Cell phones really have become at least a bane of our pollsters' existence for a couple of reasons, and I don't know how much y'all know about it, but it used to be what pollsters do is they buy essentially information from the state. And the state will say, here's all the registered voters in our state. Here's a whole list. That list is never updated or very rarely updated. So you're going to get a whole list of names. And you can backtrack, and what they used to use was phone books. They'd go through the phone books, they'd track down the names in this town, and they would pick a bunch of names, and they start calling people. You can't do that. Cell phones aren't in the phone book, right? Cell phones are very transitory. I have a cell phone that I got. Actually, I think my cell phone might be older than y'all. I got my cell phone a while ago, have the same number, so mine is a Washington State area code. I haven't lived in Washington State in a very long time. I'm probably still on the data rolls for Washington State for voter polls. So I may very well get calls out of Washington. So what I think they're going to have to do, and one of the other hang-ups is what we do with regulation of cell phones. Pollsters used to, once they got away from using phone books, they do what we call random dialing, which was they take an area code, and then they take a prefix, which indicates what town you lived in, and then they would randomly select 4 numbers, and they would call that number. So that was the best way, so they weren't, you know, subconsciously or consciously picking out specific people. They just randomly dial. You're not allowed to do that with cell phones. That's actually illegal. It's regulated.
Wow.
So pollsters can't do that either. You can't use automated polling. Like we heard a lot, we saw a big shift where you get that annoying computer voice, you know, press 1 if you want to speak to an operator kind of thing. You can't do that. That's not illegal either with cell phones. So pollsters can't do that. So they're going to have to make adjustments. How it's going to be done, it may very well be internet. Maybe internet access, link it to IP addresses. So IP address gets 1 contact. Maybe we go back to sort of old school paper ballots. Maybe we do focus groups. Maybe we start changing how we view our samples. Because you mentioned the scientific sample. How do we get a good representation of what people, whatever people,
figure it out.
Whatever people, yeah, y'all should. And as soon as you do, tell us. We can make tens of dollars with it. It'd be very exciting. But we're gonna have to start thinking and doing something differently. And to Bruce's point, the one poll that was kind of close and consistently said Donald Trump was going to win the election was a USC poll. And what they did is they had this very small sample size of people that committed to being part of the poll the entire time.
I think that's the key. And
they asked the same people over the course of time what happens next. Now, they got a lot of flack for it. The way they did it was a little funky. They had a very small sample size of people. It was like 200, I think it was closer to 500 people. But because they tracked trends as opposed to sort of this instantaneous, hey, what does this person think? What does this person think? They got a more consistent readout over time. And so when the polls would go up and go down, as Marlin would say, they were seeing the leveling and seeing a lot less of the ups and downs that come from those instantaneous or, brand new to you polls.
You mentioned, Bruce, how truthful people who are polled are with pollsters. And I don't know if this goes to truthfulness or forthrightness, but again, going back to Anthony Salvanto at CBS, he said that many of the Democrats who told pollsters that they would be turning out for Hillary Clinton ended up staying home for whatever reason. And just enough of them stayed home to cost her, according to Salvanto at CBS. And he thinks that going forward, pollsters are going to have to be more selective in polling people. They have to be very deliberate in choosing who they ask and really finding out who is going to show up at the polls. And I think that the USC poll that you mentioned was successful in that. And he said they have to be better at finding also about the so-called enthusiasm gap. And, to do a better job of modeling the electorate based on the people who are going to enthusiastically show up to vote for candidates in either party. As we found out in the exit polling and all of the navel gazing that's gone on since the election, Donald Trump's greatest strength came from whites without a college degree. And the question is, did the pollsters miss them? I guess they did in many cases. So these are all factors as we look back in this very important process. And I think that the credibility of polling has really taken a hit big time. I know that any time I mention a poll on Twitter, I get so much blowback from people who say, look what happened. These, both Democrats and Republicans, look what happened to our woman Hillary, and hey, what about our guy Donald? He really fooled everybody. So, I don't know what they're going to do about this credibility problem going forward.
The funny thing about politicians, too, is, if they have the poll numbers, they talk about the poll numbers. And if they don't have the poll numbers, they say to ignore them. It's kind of interesting. I was listening to the radio in the car on our way to this session today, and I heard about a new poll that's out, the ABC News Washington Post poll about President Trump's approval rating. And this particular poll says that the president's approval is at an all-time low at 36%. And, I think if you have a chance to go and take a look, Google ABC News Washington Post poll and go ahead and take a look at it. And it's very interesting when you go and look at it, you can slice and dice their poll by a demographic. So you can see what the poll response was by a specific kind of demographic group and doing that. And it's an interesting exercise to go through. Do we really know how accurate it is or if it's true? I just don't know. But it's certainly making a lot of news in the last 24 hours.
We talked about media literacy in one of our earlier discussions here at Franklin Pierce University here at the Fitzwater Center. And I think we have to also start thinking more and more about poll literacy. And I think that, when you look at a poll, at the bottom of the poll, it tells you what the sampling was, what the margin of error is, and all the other factors that go into a poll. So if it's legitimate, unless they're phoning up their guidelines, that's a good way to see which polls
this Washington
are scientific.
Post, if I remember correctly, this ABC News Washington Post poll had a 1,000-person sampling, and it was plus or minus 3%.
Plus or minus 3% is about what a 1,000-person sample. If you get a true 1,000-person sample, that's what the math works out to.
Yeah.
So you get that. What it works out to is a 6-point potential swing, right? You bring up some really great points. First of all, politicians love polls when the polls work for them, and they don't like polls when it don't work for them. But are we starting to see, and this is a question from an academic side, if the citizens treat polls the same, do polls become irrelevant? If they pick the polls, so media literacy, polling literacy, if they pick the polls they like and they're like, ooh, this poll looks great for whatever it is I'm interested in, healthcare, a candidate, this poll looks great, I'm going to buy into this poll, and never look at the numbers, never look at the sample size, never look at the margin of error, never look at who was asked a question. are we actually sort of weaning ourselves off of polling in some respects?
I guess it could be. I would guess that most people who looked at that poll that we just talked about would be surprised that it was developed from such a small sample of 1,000 people. And in doing that, traditionally we know that those can be statistically accurate and point a good picture by doing that. Polling for a long time has been able to do that, but I think there's a lot of distrust with the American people. I think there's a distrust in politicians, there's a distrust in the media, and I think probably it's going to be a distrust in polling as a result of at least how the trend looks to me.
Maybe they need to take a poll on polling.
Well, and it's funny, Nate Silver's 538 actually did that, a poll of pollsters after the election, after everybody blew it, some more than others, and they said, hey, how do you think the polls did? And almost universally the pollsters said, I think we did okay. We were within our margins of error. They had a lot of reasons. They were, we didn't miss it by much. It was a very tight race. A lot of us called it as a tight race. We just called it in the wrong direction. Well, one of the things we run into, I think, is what we call just poll fatigue. If y'all have a landline and during the election season, my phone did not stop ringing from about 4 p.m. to about 9 p.m. Just never stopped. And it was all kinds of polls, all kinds of, and I do this on my own, and I didn't answer half of those calls. And I always felt guilty about it. I'm like, oh, it says survey. I'm still not answering it. It's dinner time or something. But people get tired of it. And if you're all working from the same limited sample size of home phone numbers, there's more polls maybe than people to be polled at some point.
I guess.
What do you think, Bruce? You were in the White House. You covered the White House, Peter. What do they do? Because it's not just news agencies that do polls. It's not just academics that do polls. Candidates do polls. Parties do polls.
They're internals, as they call them, and you'll hear
Donald Trump's campaign manager was a pollster.
Right.
That's right.
Absolutely. Kellyanne Conway used to be a noted pollster.
And you have, Republican pollsters like her and Democratic pollsters on the other side who, get involved in all of these campaigns. And, then I always wonder if the poll is taken by a Democratic pollster or a Republican pollster, what credibility problems are there? What are the questions that they are asking, and how are they asking these questions, and to whom? I also wanted to point out before I forget that 13% of voters made up their minds in the last few weeks, and they broke more strongly for Trump. And this is something else that the pollsters missed. So a lot of lessons learned for, I'm sure that a lot of people are socking all of this information away for the next time around.
Sure. Well, I think that, that does bring up a good question. We got midterm elections coming up. We're going to start seeing polling start soon. In fact, there's been some for the special elections and stuff.
Sure.
If you guys were going to advise somebody and say, hey, look, here's what I think you should do with polls, something we can say on a webcast. What would you tell people? What do you think people need to know about polling? How they're used, what they should do with them?
Yeah, I might be a heretic. I'm not sure if I was in campaign management I would rely upon polls. Okay. I mean, certainly it's a good tool, and I wouldn't not do polling, but I think that there's other things that candidates can do, and that's to talk to as many people as possible, to be out there in the field and talk to that, to have town hall meetings and forums, and not necessarily have it with audiences of supporters. I think that they need to hear the full spectrum of the concerns that people have and what they talk about, and make their policy decisions based on those kind of interactions rather than polls. I've never been a believer that you should let polling guide your policy decisions.
You have poll-driven campaigns, which is not a good idea.
No, I just don't think it is. I think what you should do is decide about what your policies and principles are and prosecute those, and talk about the ideas that you're talking about, and hopefully the polls will follow in your direction.
You think any candidate would have the guts to just say, I'm just going to disregard polls in this campaign.
You
I
know,
don't think so.
I honestly don't know, and I don't know enough about
Some
it.
of them live and die by these things.
Well, I think so because it's been you know, it's been a science. You know, one of the things that happens with polling is that they're predicating their campaign decisions based on polling in terms of that. If they see that there is an opportunity in a battleground state to prosecute an advantage, to you know, to make a little progress, they put resources and campaign ads and television money and those kind of things in that particular market to make a difference and move the needle in terms of that. I don't know that anybody, particularly on a national basis, will be able to you know, wean themselves from that kind of tactical information because it helps them make decisions on how they want to campaign. Even if you do that in something as small as a congressional race, you know, you can do polling down to the zip code, or they call it a FIPS code, is another one of the codes that's in that, where it's a geographic area, and you can, you know, target the polling in that specific area to know that, you know, I better buy radio ads on the stations that broadcast in that county, or newspaper ads, or I need to get more volunteers to go ahead and work there. Those are all important decisions for a campaign to be able to make. So I don't think they'll be able to get away from it, Peter.
No.
I just don't think they will.
But maybe weigh it a little differently. But I'll tell you what, even if you found a candidate who's like, yes, we're going to forget the polling, we rock, we don't care what the numbers say, their donors are going to pay attention. Because the big money is not going to back a losing horse. And so, you know, poor sweet Jeb Bush, you know, starts falling behind. Where did the money go? And they were looking at broad-based national polling and then the local levels, and said, we can't spend our money that way. And with the amount of money that is currently in the political races, I think polling has a relevance. And I think even if a candidate said, yeah, we have a good idea, let's run with it, I don't think their backers are going to. And nobody's running it by themselves anymore. So I think polling's still relevant. Yay, me. I get to keep my job longer. But how do you make it better?
Right. Wonder if there are any questions out here. What do you think?
I think we should absolutely turn to these guys, see what we got here. Y'all have any questions for them?
Returning to the earlier conversation, given the statistics in which she won, given the statistics ruling in Hillary's favor in the 2016 election, in which she won the popular vote by over 3 million, do you believe that the Electoral College should be abolished in order to keep democracy as true to the people's vote as possible?
Wow.
I find that a good question.
No, it's an outstanding question. It's absolutely up for debate. Do you guys want to take a shot at that? I mean, I can certainly wing.
You start.
Okay. So, the Electoral College was designed to prevent the people from screwing up. The Founding Fathers were kind of skeptical about the capabilities, resources, and just knowledge base that the average citizen, voting citizen, keeping in mind, voting citizens back then were white male landowners. But they were still a little sketchy about how capable they would be. And they didn't want to devolve to just the people and not have the states have at least some say and give each state a relatively representative place in electing the president. So the Electoral College, in some respects, is sort of a check on democracy and a check on people getting it wrong. So it's an interesting question. How do we manage the popular vote? If you look at the popular vote nationally, she won. Hillary Clinton won by a large margin. If you look at the popular vote state by state, she didn't. So which one's right? And which one should we focus on? Does that make sense? So I think the Electoral College serves a purpose. Do I think it's necessarily the same purpose it served when we first created it? That's a different question.
Maybe I'm too stuck in history, but I don't see it changing. I don't see what it would take to change it occurring.
Right.
I think I'm with Peter on that. You know, I just I'm risk adverse and change adverse, and you just don't know what the consequences of a different system might be. It may be a flawed system, but it's a system we know.
Mm-hmm.
We'd probably have to take a poll to find out, but I don't think most Americans have the faintest idea of the little tutorial that you just offered about how it works and why it was devised the way it was.
Well, and I would just throw out also, you're talking about changing the Constitution, and I think Americans, regardless of how they feel about a specific outcome, tend to be very hesitant on reworking our foundational documents. But I think it's absolutely a debate we should have. That's the point, right? Is that we do debate this kind of stuff. That's why we're not Russia. One of many reasons.
I had 2 questions. My first one was for you. I was just wondering, you said earlier you were talking about phones and how there are certain things that are illegal for cell phones. Why are those not illegal for home phones too? Like, is there like a difference?
Go ahead. Did you?
No, I don't. I wasn't aware of this, to be quite honest with you.
They did regulate them differently. The way cell phones came about, because they're not tied, because they're mobile. There was a whole bunch of different regulations, so they sort of treat them more like. Gosh, I'm trying to think of a good example. Home phones are considered sort of your public access, right? Nobody can reach through your TV and monitor you, or your microwave. I don't care what you read. Cell phones are kind of similar to that in that they said, okay, these are going to be very specific. We originally didn't think everybody was going to have them. First of all, they were going to be business things. They were going to be like having a pager. So they regulated it. Plus, about that time, robocalls, everything started going up, and they created what we call a do not call list. You can put your home phone number on there too, and advertisers, phone solicitors can't call you at home either. So we treat cell phones differently because we didn't really know what the technology was going to look like. There's a potential you could ask to roll those rules back and say, hey, look, let's make cell phone numbers listed, let's make cell phone numbers accessible, but then how many of y'all want to pay for survey calls on your cell phone minutes?
You know, back in the old days, when I was a kid, when you got a home phone, it automatically went in the phone book. You had to default out of having your phone number listed, and you actually, I think, had to pay extra to have an unlisted phone number.
Still do in some places.
In terms of that, you know, I don't think that there is any central directory of cell phone numbers in terms of that. So it just makes it much more complicated to have it be organized.
Yeah, cell phones are not listed in the phone book. Actually, at any given time in California, up to 50% of the phone numbers, even just landline phones, are not listed because the population is so transient. So you get a apartment, you get a new cell phone, or you get a new landline phone. It takes a year. Phone books come out once a year. How often does that number change?
I mean, who even relies on a phone book anymore?
Right, exactly.
So.
I always think it's cute when they drop them off in my driveway. So
Oh, and my second question, it was about the credibility that you, Mr. Mayor, was talking about. In the White House, I know that you guys aren't there now, but do you think that when polls are brought up as like a support of something, or I guess support, or like evidence to support something, do you think that they go with them and believe them, or are they like, oh, those aren't credible, we're going to ignore them?
You know, I'm not a close follower of the briefings, but I would be very surprised if they didn't just disregard them and point to what happened in the 2016 campaign. Although, as Bruce said, when a poll is going the way of certain politicians, you know, they'll be glad to point to them.
Yeah, I think when they have the numbers, they use the numbers, and when they don't have them, they ignore them. I will say this: I think some policy decisions can be influenced by polling. You know, I think we have I don't know this to be true, but I suppose it to be true right now, that there is a great big policy debate going on about the repeal and replace of the Affordable Health Care Act, what's commonly referred to as Obamacare. And the Republicans right now are trying to figure out, you know, what to do and how to go forward with that. And I've got to think that they're trying to keep a finger on the pulse of what the American people think and making those decisions on guiding the legislation as it goes through. So,
especially senators who are going to be up for re-election.
Exactly. You know, if you're in a state and it makes a difference in that, and that particular issue is maybe predicating if you're going to be re-elected or not, you know, it's something that they would consider and take a look at. So, yeah, I think it has an influence on things. You know, I don't know if it always puts the thumb on the scale all the time, but I think it's something people consider.
Just throw out there that maybe they may not be relying so much on like the sort of nationally televised or nationally published polls. They're very likely doing polling on their own, internally with a specific demographic, a specific sample that they want to find out about, and they'll keep that all internal, and they may be relying on that. They're not necessarily looking at the Washington Post, ABC poll, and saying, oh boy, people hate healthcare, or whatever. They're looking and saying, oh wait, but my supporters love our plan, and that may be what's those are the kind of polls that may be influencing them.
And as was pointed out, there is a pollster in a high position in the White House, and that may be, influencing their use of them too. And all the White Houses that I covered, they were constantly, but doing a lot of polling and relying a lot of polling from their party apparatus also, for sure.
Absolutely.
The Republican National Committee, the Democratic National Committee, the Republican Senatorial Committee, the Democratic Senatorial Committee, the congressional committees on both sides of the aisle, they're all doing polling.
And the state levels, sure.
Where the polls were so wrong in this last election, how do you think that's going to impact the trust and participation in polls in the next election?
I think it's going to hurt it.
Yeah, a couple of problems we run into with polling anyway is, as these guys mentioned, sometimes people lie. My husband loves to do that. He loves to go, stop that, you're screwing up somebody's math. But he thinks that's hysterically funny. People will lie for a variety of reasons. They're less likely to be forthright if they don't believe that they're participating in something valid, or they're flat just not going to answer the phone, or take the internet survey, or answer, fill out a postcard. I do think it's going to be something that has to be overcome. Anytime you lose credibility, lose legitimacy, you have to figure out a way to overcome that. For me, it's, hey, I'll talk to high school students, I'll talk to these guys, and I'll talk to whoever and say, hey, look, we screwed up, we're going to own it, and here's how we're making it better.
Most of the time through the last century, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, there was a thing that politicians did called canvassing. They used to go door to door and ask the questions. It was like, taking a census and doing all that. I can remember, living in suburban Chicago when I was in grade school, and my parents did the canvassing, in terms that they asked those kind of questions. I don't know if it's particularly practical to get that kind of thing, but I think in essence there has to be some sort of a modern day equivalent of canvassing to figure out what people are thinking about so decisions can be made in the future.
And great political reporters also have done canvassing. The late David Broder with the Washington Post was just such an expert at going into pivotal precincts and neighborhoods and asking people the right questions and putting it into his reporting. And one of his colleagues, Dan Baltz with the Washington Post, has followed in that vein and has done a great job of doing it. Yeah. And I think, frankly, it's easier for print reporters to do than for broadcast reporters, because there's something intimidating about a microphone, and add a camera to the mix and it becomes even more intimidating, and people kind of stiffen up and are probably a lot more determined and cautious in their responses. But I think, and again, this is not scientific when you do this kind of canvassing, but it's an important part of reporting. As a reporter, I have to say, I always hated it when the assignment editor said, go out and do some MOS, which was man on the street.
Yeah.
Man and woman on the street. I hated it to go, and I was based in Washington, and there's a very important state next door in Virginia, and Virginia is, really a hotbed of politics and a swing state.
Come on, you live in Virginia.
I do. It's a swing state, and politics is very exciting there. But I, would go out to Manassas, Virginia, and try to find a cross-section of voters and ask them such and such. A lot of people, slam doors and stomp away when they see you coming with a microphone.
Other questions?
Yeah, I had one. It's kind of has two parts to it. One, it's just kind of confirmation. So do you agree with the concept of polling then? And if you don't, then do you think you should get rid of it?
I do. You know, if done scientifically, you were taught this morning about push polls and straw polls and web polls. You know, those are not reliable. But if done the right way, I still, despite what happened, and now that we've studied it and we know what happened in 2016, hopefully we can get past it and improve the next time around. We will have the test in the midterms, for sure. We'll see how they do in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, and some of those important swing states, Virginia. But no, I continue to believe in polls, and I don't think they should be trashed.
I think it's a useful tool if we can take steps to ensure the accuracy. You know, I don't have a whole lot of use for bad polling, but good polling's a pretty good thing to have.
I would just throw out there, you know, to these guys' point, it has to be a good poll, and so that means you have to be able to identify what might be a good poll. You know, the consumer of the polls needs to pay a little bit of attention to what they're getting. But the other thing the polls do that we haven't really talked about is it provides information on what your fellow citizens think about stuff that interests you. Would you have the opportunity to figure out what folks in Idaho think about the health care bill, or if you didn't have somebody doing the polling and providing that information to you? So if you don't have to let peer pressure and poll pressure swing your vote, but it's useful to understand what other people are thinking.
That is a great point.
More information is always good.
Is. Yeah.
I'm a teacher.
If good polls aren't inherently bad, but politicians shouldn't use them to guide their policy decisions, how should politicians use good polls?
I don't see any reason they shouldn't use them to help guide policy decisions, to know what the people are thinking and wanting.
If they're driving their campaigns, I guess at that.
Oh, driving their campaigns. It's almost an ethical question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And boy, you start mixing ethics and politics. That's troublesome.
Yeah, I guess I'd answer it a little bit different way. That's a nuanced line. I mean, in driving the decision. When I said I don't think polling should drive a policy decision, I guess I was thinking about the political archetype that blows in the wind and changes their position based on whatever somebody is saying today, right, and revises there. I think that certain candidates and campaigns and maybe political parties have a point of view that they go ahead and look at, and they can use polling to affirm their own assumptions and policy goals about what's happening, that they think that this is important to their constituents and all that. I think a politician should listen to the people at home, and it's a representative form of government, and they should take into consideration what their constituents think and address themselves accordingly in that. I just think that it should be done responsibly.
So think of it as like an ingredient in a dinner you're making. I'm hungry, sorry. So I'm on food kick. So, let's say butter's an ingredient in the food you're making. If you rely too much on butter, you're going to end up in a hospital sooner or later, right, with a coronary. So you need to use it in moderation. Polling is the same way. It is useful information, used correctly, probably won't kill you or your campaign, right? So I think if you think of it that way.
Or your policy decisions.
Or your policy decisions, exactly.
How do you feel the non-scientific or like the bad polling affects election results?
I think that it can affect news coverage if different media organizations are not careful. But your exact question again was, I didn't hear it.
How does the bad polling, as you guys were saying, affects the campaign results? Would you say, or
You mean the outcome?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, again, it's all in the mind of the beholder and the way people react to it. And again, that goes to polling literacy and people understanding, and I don't know that we'll ever be able to get people to, to get it when it comes to, I mean, it was a long time before I got it, when I was in school, I guess I learned about polling and how it works. You guys are getting a real good jump on it by being here, if I may say so, but bad polling does have an influence, and that, especially in the internet age, with social media and so forth, these things just spread like wildfire. Did you see this poll, or someone will tweet out about some push poll result or something that went on in certain states?
So what you can do is draw a line in the sand yourselves by asking the question, what was the sample size? What were the questions that were asked? Who was asked about those? So you can make a determination if it's an accurate and true response in all that. So if you see a social media post about a particular poll, don't just go on the veneer of what's being reported in that tweet. Look a little bit deeper inside to make your own consideration. Is that something that you should consider as a valid point to drive your decision making, or is it bullshit?
During the day, I'd see during the election, during the campaign, I would constantly see on Facebook friends of mine and others referring to polls, and you'd look at it and you'd know that this was not a scientific poll. This was not done by a reputable outfit, but because it reflected in a good light for their candidate, they were pumping it out there to all of their friends on Facebook or on Twitter or various other social media.
Inaccurate polling, bad polling is like gossip. Okay, people get together and they start talking about somebody or talking about something, right? Bad gossip is going to have an effect. How many people buy into that gossip is going to determine the level of that effect. So it really boils down. So yeah, sharing on Facebook and Twitter and talking about it with your friends, you're essentially, talking about gossip is what it boils down to. Yeah.
So you all seem to have a very good grasp on statistics, modeling, statistical
I have a computer to do that.
methodology.
No, but yeah, okay.
But I mean, the principles, the
Right.
foundation. I'm guessing, I hypothesize that the general population doesn't. So I guess I have two questions, and it's not my area of expertise either. I guess my questions are twofold. One, how can the media help to better educate the public so that way they can use polls in the way that you talk about, knowing about their strengths but also their limitations? And what specific things do they need to know in order to better understand how polls can be useful and what those limitations might be?
I guess I would say, in response to that, is don't use polling as your only tool, because it's just one of the things that can inform an opinion on it. I have a friend that's a reporter that specializes in data analysis, and this reporter looks at data from places like the Pew Foundation, the Census Bureau, the Department of the Treasury and Commerce, and they take all of these different data points and extrapolate that into their reporting, and then might layer in a poll on top of that. And so the poll isn't the only thing that's informing a decision on that. So my advice to these journalism students, or to just citizens, consumers, and all of that is, take a look at the poll and consider that, but also listen to the policy statements, listen to the debates. Go to a political event, particularly if you live here in New Hampshire. You can't swing a dead cat and not run into a politician and hear what they have to say. And so listen to what they have to say and use all of those things to inform your opinion and decision on what you want to think about and how you want to act in your own political decisions in the future.
I think you're onto something in terms of the media doing a better job. I can think back to the campaign, and there were several instances where that my former employer, CBS News, did do reporting and discussions on how polling worked. They would do it during primary coverage, some of the big Super Tuesday type primaries. the primary here, the caucuses in Iowa, and explain exactly how they would go about doing it. Of course, you have more of a luxury to do that online on the .com side to explain it in depth as to how it is done. And I just told you about the post-mortem that they did on the CBS Evening News and some of the other broadcasts with this guy, Anthony Salvanto, explaining it. But, you know, the media can always do a better job, like a lot of other institutions, at a lot of things. But I think, you know, this is a very good idea that all of them, you know, should be doing from, you know, every single media operation should do a better job of explaining polling, especially after what happened in 16.
I'll give you one easy example that every news agency could do with absolutely no trouble whatsoever. Instead of saying president approval rating is 36%, tell them what you asked the people in the first place and tell them who you asked. Say, we asked 1,000 citizens of New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island how they felt about the first 5 months of President Trump's presidency, and here's the scale we gave them: strongly approve, strongly disapprove. Give them the question. Don't just give them the numbers, because to Bruce's point and to Peter's point, the numbers aren't, they're just numbers, right? We can do all kinds of cool stuff with numbers, especially with a computer. But tell them what it legitimately means, and don't rely on just this, like, bam, clickbait number, 36%, you know, 38%, 42%. Whatever. That doesn't mean anything. It really doesn't in terms of it's just a number. Okay? It's like age. It's just a number. It doesn't really mean anything, right? Other questions?
Thanks for listening.
So, how many of y'all wanted to start becoming a pollster? Oh, same number of hands as questions. All right.
Can they use polling in their high school news reporting, and how would let me just point who goes to a public high school? Okay, how many students are in your high school?
200 including middle school.
Okay, 200. What would the sample be in a school with 200 students?
Depends on what you want to research. Sample size is all about what you want to know. So let's say you want to. Do y'all have a football stadium? All right, let's see. Maybe you guys want to find out if everybody wants a football stadium. Okay, who would you ask?
Athletes.
Okay, but the athletes, are they going to be the only ones that are invested in having a football stadium? No. Okay, who else might be interested? Any other guesses?
The entire school.
Ooh, the entire school. Okay, so what do you mean by the entire school? Every student there?
I mean, not everybody in the school is going to think that funding should go towards a football stadium.
See, we just had a key word there. So you got athletes, who I think absolutely are important because, you know, maybe you get more people coming to school. But the entire school, does that include faculty? Does that include staff? What about the parents that are paying their taxes for you to go to that school? Should they be polled, right? So what you need to look at, I'll give you sort of the down and dirty. Let's say you got a research question in your high school. Who's impacted? That's the number of people that you're going to start with. That's the base. And then you need to figure out, okay, how can I pick out enough people that I will get an equal representation, even if I don't have the opportunity to talk to all 200 some odd students. We're going to, you know, say 2 parents. We're 800. Let's say you're looking at about 900 people potentially that are going to be impacted by a football stadium. How many people do you need to talk to make sure you represent all of those 900, even if you don't talk to all 900? That's the tricky, right? So you know you need to talk to some athletes. You know you need to talk to some non-athletes, right? You probably want to talk to those middle schoolers to figure out if they would be really excited to go to a high school that has a football stadium. Got to talk to parents who are paying the taxes that are getting you that football stadium. Administrators, is there what's going to be a drawback? What's going to be a positive for having a football stadium?
What about the drama kids who want a new theater instead of the stadium?
And you're going to want to talk to people that are going to say, because you said not everybody's going to want a football stadium. Cool. What else could you use the money for? So you want to make sure you get all of those people represented. So let's say you got that 900 people. Probably going to want to talk to a minimum of 100 people. But you could do it if you pick the right 100 people, you could get it right.
I still read some high school papers, and you see like photo features where there's like a question of the week. You know, what do you think about Taco Tuesday, or
Absolutely.
you know, or whatever? And of course, it's not a poll, is it? It's
Well,
you know, it's a
straw
feature.
poll. Yeah,
it's a straw poll kind of thing.
And there's nothing. Let's be clear. There's nothing wrong with doing an opinion poll. You don't have to get all down and dirty, but the more scientific you are about picking out who you talk to, the more accurate your outcome is going to be. Now, if you say, hey, do we like Taco Tuesdays? Let's take a poll and see how many people will participate in it. That's a legit response, and especially for a high school paper. The bigger the story, the bigger the issue, the more scientific you really want to get with it to give yourself credibility and legitimacy.
You know, in your own school, there's mechanically feasible ways to do a survey that doesn't require that it be on the internet or do anything like that. A paper survey where each one of the surveys is numbered, so you know that you're only going to get the exact number back that you handed out, could be an effective way of doing something for that. So if you you hand it out to you know, in a school with 900 kids, you could hand out 900 of those ballots, and they could be numbered from 1 to 900, and then you got those back. You could tabulate the results of 5 or 6 questions and all of that pretty easily. You know, it's some pen and paper work and taking a look at that. So
absolutely, and that's all legit. And you're not going to get all 900 back, so you're going to, you know, the math gets a little bit easier the more you go on. Those are, especially at a high school level, especially for even a local level, if you're just doing local politics, those are all reasonable, legitimate. I've done them. I did them in college. I did them in high school, where we did surveys, you know, among our population, or we did it in the town, you know.
I actually think that it can be interesting to do editorial polls, just as long as you're identifying it as what it is. You know, you can use a tool online like SurveyMonkey, and then when you write about it, say it's an unscientific poll. We asked this question, and these are the responses. That's still interesting and newsworthy. You just have to be clear about you know, knowing that it's non-scientific and that the results could be weighted because somebody might have done something.
Yeah, again, it's a credibility, legitimacy issue. As long as you tell people what you did,
that's okay.
It'd really be neat if you took this back to your papers and did some kind of polling.
Yeah.
Again,
ask them what they think about polls.
As Bruce said,
do the poll on polling.
You have to just explain what the basis is for it. But I think it'd be neat.
I think so. I think it'd be fascinating. Y'all are the up-and-coming voters. We would love to know what you guys think about polling from a pollster perspective. Right?
So often school polls through the years, you know, weekly reader polls of boy, I may be dating myself now, but you know, some of the polls that are taken of school kids, they know what their moms and dads are saying at home, and it's predicted the outcome. Some of them have been pretty successful at predicting the outcome of elections.
And the kids are a lot more willing to blurt out their parents' political preferences
than their parents
maybe. So yeah, kids say the darndest things. Right? Yeah, absolutely.
So, how do you go about doing a poll on something that perhaps the majority of people are not informed enough to make a decision about?
Yeah.
Like, this is something that I have thought about a good deal myself, but like voting systems for the presidential election and such, like our system is not good. we need to switch to a different system, but like most people do not understand the problems.
Okay. Yeah, that's an excellent point. Realistically, because we talked a little bit this morning about what we call non-attitudes, where people will answer questions even if they don't know anything about the topic. Okay, and those are always a potential downfall of even really good polls. You got to have an information campaign first. You can do a screening question. So, have you voted in the last election? Did you use this kind of machine? Did you have, you know, you can do those kind of screening questions and then try and weed out people that don't know anything. You may end up with a very small sample size that way sometimes.
Yeah.
So I do a lot of foreign policy stuff as well. We were joking about Russia earlier this morning, right? The level of detail that people know is going to shape how you ask questions and what kind of questions you can ask and who you can ask questions to. And that's part of figuring out who and what to ask.
So, and you guys noted that education is really important, especially at a younger age, with all these political statistics and polls and so on. Now, with that, do you think that being more critical of all of these sources should be included in that education, or could it do more hurt than harm, especially in today's day and age with so much going on in the media and so on, especially with all these different stories popping up? And should we teach people to really second guess whether or not they should be passing on a story?
Whether they should be
Passing on a story that they see online.
Well, we've talked a lot about that over the past couple of days about the media literacy factor, and then we got into the polling literacy factor in this session. I just think that playing it straight and yes, including criticism of the way things have worked, should be part of the education process, for sure.
I'd say the more you know, the more you know. A better informed opinion lets you make better decisions.
Information's never wasted, and there's a difference between being a skeptic and being a cynic. You can question, and you should always ask questions. You should always be a 5-year-old. Why? Okay? That's totally different than saying no. Saying why, asking why, is totally different than saying no. So being a skeptic is always a good thing. You should question everything, at least for a little while. Right?
Well, thank you.
Thank you
for a wonderful conversation about polling, and I'm especially intrigued by the media or poll literacy idea, and I think we're going to have to look at that for the Fitzwater Center.
Yeah.
And keep asking why. That was a good way to end the conversation. So thank you.
Thank you, guys.